All right, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the last seminar of this semester. Today we have Danah Boyd as our last speaker. Danah is an incoming professor in communications at Cornell University, founder of the Data and Society Research Institute, and a partner researcher at Microsoft Research. She is a leading theorizer who developed influential conceptual frameworks for understanding today's digital society through rich ethnographic observations and synthesizing those observations with fresh theories. Just like the beautiful balance that you find in her name here, Danah Boyd, the symmetry in that balance you see there. Her empirical research and theorizing also strikes this beautiful balance on many levels. There's that balance between the treatment or balanced treatment between the social forces that shape technology, as well as the technological infrastructures that shape these social forces, between classical and modern social theories, and between deep observations on the bleeding edge, technological affordances, and theoretical frameworks to make sense of them. Her substantive domains of interests are broad, from the mundane, micro-level social interactions among teens in the early days of social media, and up to this day, the ethics of big data and data science, to the public data infrastructure of the United States. So without further ado, please welcome Danah Boyd.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I mean, free food, right? So I get it, and you can wander off if you want. This is an exciting talk for me to give because this is work that spans from the earliest days of my research agenda into setting in place the things that I'm about to start doing. I say that because if you've come to hear about the census, I am sorry I'm not giving you a census talk. And many of you might be very glad because many of my friends are sick about hearing about the C word. But for those who don't know, I've got a book that I just am under review right now about the 2020 census and the making of data. So we can have fun on that topic, but that's not today. Today, I want to give you a talk trying to make sense of how I've been thinking about social relationships and the role of technology in those processes more generally. So as a queer kid growing up in Pennsylvania, because it's nice to be back. So I grew up in Lancaster, born in Altoona, and I spent a large amount of my time in various online chat rooms before people were scared of them, talking to all sorts of people who supported me in really, really powerful ways. And as a queer kid, just confuses the heck out of many things about what was going on with my life and my identity. I was really enamored with all the people who were there to be supportive. And I was really struck by how that was such a very specific moment in time. And we'll come back to that. But I want to point this out there because there was an era in which a lot of people went online and got meaningful social support. Relationships were formed that would change their lives. And for me, a lot of those relationships were truly strangers, people whose names I will never know, who in many ways I think of as having saved my life by helping me out in really crucial periods of time. But this is what got me interested in technology. And I went to college, studied computer science, and then got obsessed with networks and network visualization. And I know that there are some folks from my old world here with us today. And in my obsession with networks and how relationships were formed, along came the rise of the next wave of social network sites. Friendster, for those of you who are not familiar with this site, was a site that predated Facebook and MySpace, one of the earliest of the second wave of social network sites that sort of we live with us today. And I say this because I came to a lot of these technologies thinking that these would be really powerful ways of building communities and making connections. And it took me a while to really come to grips with different forms of idealism. Like, I very much grew up on the, technology could allow us and empower us to make meaningful connections. But then I got to watch, since, let's say 2003, as financial interests contorted different kinds of technology companies to become the data-hungry monsters that we are stuck with today. Ones that are very much hell-bent on manipulating and altering the kinds of social relationships that are at play. And I spent a lot of time trying to grapple with this tension, right? What does it mean that my experiences and so many people's experiences with technology are empowering and loving and awesome, and whoa, are we in a dark place right now? And as I come back to a very sort of old concept, which is that technology is neither good nor bad, and it's also not neutral. And one of the things I wrote about in my first book was about how the internet regularly mirrors the good, bad, and ugly of everyday life. And how these technologies are used by different kinds of political and ideological forces to rearrange the social conditions. It is not the technology or its affordances that do that work, but different actors with different incentives and different resources to make that possible. So I've been struggling with this over and over again, and so I wanted to come back to thinking about what it takes to really form social structures that are healthy. Because in many ways, this project that we are often, interested in, things like democracy, are dependent on, these kinds of social fabrics being healthy. Okay, so what is a social fabric? I'm using the word social fabric rather than social network, in part because the word social network has been taken over by the technology sites, and I want to get us away from that. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge that the concept of social network dates back to the 1950s, and it does have a particular meaning in sociology. So those scholars who studied, structures of people and their relationships with one another talked a lot about sociograms, for those who lived in that frame. And since the 50s, we've seen, scores of sociologists and anthropologists who really want to understand what are the social structures that exist within society and what do they precondition into being, right? Which is to say that something like Mark Granovetter's work, sort of canonical work of Strength of Weak Ties, he pointed out that weak ties, social relationships that are not your besties, but like people that you generally know, are actually critical for your ability to find out about new job opportunities. They're critical for the diversity of communities and especially organizations. They have very important values. They don't necessarily result in good outcomes just because you have those weak ties, but they are a necessary precondition. So I think it's important to realize that a lot of this work is not necessarily proscriptive. It doesn't necessarily say just because the system is structured in a particular way, it will have this positive or negative outcome. It was much more descriptive. But all of this work about what was going on in terms of social networks also has an even earlier date to it. And this sociological work likes to forget about the earlier version of it, which was referred to as social engineering. Right? And there's a lot of reasons why people like to forget the history of social engineering, because in the latter part of the 19th century, with the rise of the eugenics movement, which was a very popular department within universities. Let's remember that eugenics was considered high status elite academia for a long time. There was a whole concept, coming out of eugenics, out of the idea that we could identify the smartest or best humans in a particular way, and that we could also engineer those social structures. And so the social engineering as a project begins in 1899 to really describe the scientific approach to managing the humans, right? And one branch of this is efficiency and modernization, terms that we still live with today. Which is like, how do you structure the systems well to produce the desirable social outcomes that you want? I say this because this whole area of research got really dark really fast. We know it for its real intense racist legacies, but it also became deeply problematic in terms of how it drove different kinds of militarism. I say this because I also want to revisit some of the underlying questions around social engineering, because I think they're important to grapple with while acknowledging that atrocious past. And part of it is that we have to acknowledge when and where social structures have enabled certain outcomes that can in many ways be quite constructive. And so I've spent a lot of time looking back at different kinds of dynamics around war. And what does war actually produce in terms of different kinds of social conditions that we have to deal with. And one of the most fascinating ones for me, going back through the US history, has to do with the American Civil War. So the American Civil War ends in 1865, and if you grew up in this country, you got to go through some education that told you that Reconstruction brought you back together, and the North and South suddenly got along, right? Which is laughable on many fronts. But the thing that's also really notable is what did it actually take for North and South to stop fighting one another about whether or not the country could actually stay together. And that fight had actually happened for the next 50 years. The country was regularly on the brink of separating again, right? And let's be clear, this is not just a story of the South being racist and the North not. The North was just as bloody racist, but it had different formations and different ideas of distrust. These were deep polarization of relationships that had been torn to sunders. People did not know people across the North and the South. And then World War I happens. And what happens at World War I is that the United States sends white male, young people off to Europe, or frankly, mostly off to Kansas, and then they try to eventually get to Europe, in order to fight that war. And what's notable is how they formed those units, those military units of white men. Those military units of white men were formed across the North and the South. And they came back after World War I having social relationships that were very, very powerful. This was sort of interesting and notable, but it becomes even more powerful during World War II, where what we have is we have segregated, military units, black and white, and still all male. But again, people are formed across the North and the South and build relationships. Not only are do they have this formation across the North and the South in the US, but black units and white units, when they actually touch down, say in Normandy, are working alongside one another. Why is this so notable? It turns out if you look at the early days of the civil rights movement in the United States, like if you look at what was happening in the 1950s, not the 1960s, these are all relationships formed during World War II. And what you will find is that most of the powerful civil rights actors of the 50s who built the foundation for what we think of as the civil rights movements knew each other and were willing to support each other through these military connections. That's how people had housing in Selma. That is how people came together and worked across different churches, was through these formations of military. Now, the military project was not meant to form these social relationships that become the foundation of critical movements in the US, but they do so. And that's the thing about war. War brings people together and it tears people apart. It depends on a segregated structure. So when we think about, for example, what has happened in places where you've seen civil wars of different form, they almost always begin with separation of populations long before the physical conflict begins. This is critical to understanding what happened in North Ireland. This is also critical to understand, say, Yugoslavia, both Sudan and South Sudan, and it is critical to understand when we deal with Israel and Palestinian conflict. 2006 meant a complete wall between Gazans and Jewish Israelis. That meant decades of relationships being separated before a war begins. And I say this because one of the biggest challenges in responding to wars and structures is to build and really reknit those networks. You cannot do it without those social formations. And so as long as you don't have those social formations, you will continue to be at war. And one of the most interesting things of recovery after wars, or as wars are trying to sort of go from a violent place to a stable place, is the building of social relationships in a strong way. Those projects we can think of as war, but they are also part of all sorts of social environments that we live with on a daily basis. We knit together people as a social project in all sorts of ways. This is one of the powers of understanding the work of churches, for example, is knitting together social relationships. It is the power of US summer camps, right? And the why summer camps bring people together in different forms. This has to do with professional structures. If you want to understand Silicon Valley's power, it is the relationship between workers across tons of different companies. Right? And for the longest time, at the heyday of what we think of as the height of Silicon Valley before it became all money, before 2008, the average tenure of a person in Silicon Valley was they were at a company for 1 year. Think about that. That meant that their relationships and bonds knit together the entire environment. And so when towns like Pittsburgh are like, we're going to create a tech industry, but don't focus on the social formations, they miss the power of what happens in some of these other environments. One of the most important forms of social formation in the United States has to do with the university project. And the university project, of course, is under attack. And it's under attack because of what it does as a social project, not what it does in terms of an intellectual project. Think about the very fact of an undergrad being shipped off to a college dorm far from home with a roommate that they may or may not like, right? And that is the stark reality of this. Those relationships, those dorming relationships, are a social engineering project. They are a social engineering project that we pretend is just about whether you're a smoker or not, for all the old people in the room who remember those forms. But now are just this moment of like, how do you form a class together? And when I interview people that do residential dormitory work, I'm always fascinated by the thoughtfulness that goes into the project of putting people together in a dormitory, because they know those relationships matter. They know that overwhelmingly students are likely to marry people in not only from the same college, but from the same dorm, right? You have that kind of strong social tie formation. And so when you look to other countries, whenever I'm in Europe, people are like, what is up with American universities? Like, I don't understand. I'm like, how many of your people actually leave home to go to university? They're like, none. Why would you do that? I'm like, you do that because this is how we make elites in America. This is how we make, the project of education is the project of making social formations. And that is, of course, what's being critiqued right now, because who gets to be a part of that and who doesn't is a political project, right? Let's also be clear that discomfort is one of the most powerful bonding structures. And so I say this because when I was doing my early work on MySpace, back when MySpace was cool, hard to believe, people were really interested in trying to find the possible college people, that they couldn't figure it out. And then Facebook launched and finally allowed high school students to go onto Facebook. The first thing people did was find the people that they would go to college with. They pre-formed relationships on Facebook before even showing up to college, which meant that they self-segregated in critical ways. And I don't mean racially, I mean in terms of all sorts of interests and values. So rather than living through the discomfort of being in a dorm with somebody you don't really like, you actually saw these relationships separate out on campus before even people arrived. Cell phones have actually been deadly on campuses, but not for the reasons that people expect. They're deadly because people are far more comfortable maintaining their relationships with their high school mates than going through the discomfort of negotiating new relationships on campus. And that is actually a part of why we've had so much social segregation in our country over the last decade. So it's not technology that did it. It's the fact that we as humans are far more comfortable talking to people that are like us, far more comfortable talking to our old high school mates than going through the discomfort of being a part of a social engineering project. So I want to point this out because a nation, if we go back to classic theory of Benedict Anderson, is an imagined community. We create the nation into being, and whether you believe in the national project or not, we believe in forms of community. Community is imagined together. You build it collectively. You build it so that you can do something as larger than the individuals. But that requires the social structures to back that up. That requires coming together across difference in a really powerful way. So I point all of this because this is one set of things that I've been sort of obsessed with. Now let's take another thing. So I'm going to put you together a set of tapestries of ideas. So it's not surprising to hear that there's an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. We hear constant conversations about various versions of this. And that loneliness, of course, being correlated with negative mental health outcomes. And I'm sort of fascinated by all of this anxiety because one of the things that we know is critical to this is that loneliness is about building social, the response to loneliness is to build social relationships. So why is it that we keep narrating this conversation of loneliness, but don't think about what it takes to cultivate connections and relationships? It's easier to blame technology and say, if we made the technology go away, suddenly people will build relationships. It's just like, I think we're missing some correlation causation dynamics here. And so a decade ago, I published a book where I pointed out all sorts of different things that were happening with young people in terms of their restrictions of being able to access community. And one of the things that I published in 2014 was that there was a huge restriction in young people's access to physical spaces, and that had begun in the 1970s. So if you ever hear a current person telling you that it all started in 2012, it did not. This is something that sort of goes way back in terms of kids' limited access to public space. And that's been sort of intriguing to me because I started looking back and thinking about what was going on there with a new set of fights about kids' access to public spaces. And I realized that there was something in my data when I went back to it that I had not paid attention to. It has to do with the ways in which young people's access to not just public space, but other adults in their life. And one of the reasons why it became more visible to me and why I returned to my data over the last year is because there's been this interesting new obsession with how parenting is operating at the present. And so there's a pretty dominant paradigm that's usually amongst scholars referred to as intensive parenting. In American culture, it's just referred to as common sense. But the intensive parenting idea is that to be a good parent, and if you are a good parent, you will produce good kids. So we should discuss or unpack some of the normative assumptions there. But the idea is that you spend significant amount of time cultivating your child into being a good kid, making them well-rounded, giving them opportunities, etc. This, of course, is historically dominant within elite environments, but it has become far more commonplace across many economic spectrums. But the poorest members of our society do not tend to adopt this as much because they don't have the privilege to be able to adopt this. But from middle class through upper class, this is completely commonplace. The result is, of course, that there's a lot of guilt. You're not doing it right. You're not doing it enough. If you're working, you're not home for your kids. This is all terrible, right? And all of these kinds of social dynamics that are at play. Such that last year, we've started to see all of this new challenge around how parents are under pressure and that parents are having psychological meltdowns all over the place, which is generally true. Because parents feel this unbelievable pressure to do it right and feel like there's no way in which they could possibly do it right. And so this pressure has been building up and is actually creating all sorts of interesting costs. Now, I want to be clear, there's various versions of intensive parenting. You'll hear some of them, especially if you're a professor, navigating parents who feel the need for undergrads to keep coming at you. Because this includes versions of helicopter parenting, right, as one variation of it. It also, at the younger years, involves attachment parenting. As you have parents all the way through to a child being in college feeling like they need to be involved in everything. And if you, as a professor, possibly gave your a student a B, the likelihood in which you are going to get a call from a parent has increased exponentially in recent years, which is very depressing and frustrating. But most of these discussions about, parent anxiety and parent challenges and with young people is about whether or not young people can grow up to be independent, and whether intensive parenting is healthy for adults, whether it's healthy for young people. But it's actually overlooking some of the other social formations, and that's what I want to flag and focus on. Because the thing is that parents and their actions, their choices of how they live in this world, set the norms for their children. And so one of the things that I found that had been on the decline for decades, but it went acute during pandemic, is about how often parents socialize with other adults in front of children. The answer, less and less common. That's terrifying. So young people do not see adults socialize. In fact, what young people tend to see in terms of adult socializing is that the adults pick up this and check out. Right? And they are socializing. They see themselves as maintaining a friendship, but their children do not get to see the social dynamics of the maintenance of a friendship. And this is actually also connected to a lot of the loneliness and isolation. Of course, parents will tell you they're too busy. They can't possibly fit it in. Their house is too messy. They don't want to host people, any number of explanations. But this is statistically something that is increasingly costly because kids do not get to see the possibilities of socialization. And they think of adults and adults' loneliness as part of what it means to be an adult. And that's terrifying because if you have an entire generation growing up thinking that being an adult sucks, that does not bode well for where things start to go. But there's another dynamic here, which I've been really struck by. And again, I found in my data and was not paying attention to it from a decade ago, which is about how much access young people have to non-custodial adults. Now, what is a non-custodial adult? This means an auntie or a coach or a pastor or a mentor. These people that are peripherally in a young person's life, but on a regularly consistent place where they get to see them as they grow up. Think neighbors, etc. The thing about non-custodial adults is that they are the ones who young people often turn to about and try to make sense of other things other than their parents, right? Like, how crazy are my parents? You ask a non-custodial adult. But the other thing that's been really challenging is that parents have minimized how much access kids can have to non-custodial adults in their life. And they've been doing this for a long time. This has been the decline of sleepovers because any possible other adult might be a pedophile. This is the decline of like allowing kids to just like hang out in the neighborhood because all of those neighbors, they're not to be trusted, right? So there's a distrust that comes from it. And then it sort of slowly seeped into the logics of communities where young people don't know anybody. And the reason that I came back to this is that for years I'd been watching this. I'd been watching people sort of things, and then COVID happened. And COVID meant that young people had no access to non-custodial adults, right? That any adult that they did have access to was really taken out of their world during COVID. And when we re-entered in an environment where kids were socializing, those non-custodial adults did not actually return. And some of it is because teachers were too stressed out in their own lives to actually be able to be supportive for people, right? Everybody had gotten to a point where it's like, I don't know that I trust anybody. And so there was a crazy form of distance. And I was like, this is really, really problematic. And I worry about what this means until I got to actually see it in the data. So I was a founding member of an organization called Crisis Text Line, which is a mental health organization for people that when they are in crisis, where they can text and get social support. And so I've gotten to see all of the processes of at this point, millions of conversations, overwhelmingly by young people and counselors trying to get support. And the thing is that we've been running this site since 2013 and seeing different kinds of patterns that come and go with it. But there's a couple of things that we know in terms of how to support young people when they're in a crisis. And one of the most important things has to do with how you de-escalate a suicide. So when you are in the middle of a suicide attempt, your first goal is to get rid of the mode, get rid of the gun, get rid of the pills, make it so that that is much harder, add friction. You don't want it to be easy to die by suicide tonight. You don't try to solve the underlying problem. You're not going to do that in a crisis scenario. That is a systemic issue. You got to work at that longer term. So your goal is to keep that person alive for 24 to 48 hours, which means that your next major goal is to find a trusted person that person can talk to tomorrow morning within the next 24 hours, really, because these calls are usually at night. So what can you do? Who can you identify? And so you do a lot of work with the person, whether they're calling or texting, trying to alternate plan and build social relationships. And what we started to see during COVID, and we have not bounced back from, is young people coming in and saying, I have nobody else to turn to. That is bloody terrifying, right? And the probability for Crisis Text Line of us sending an active rescue, meaning we're sending law enforcement, which is not our favorite thing to do, to actually make certain that person survives the night, increases exponentially when we have we have no ability to de-escalate here. But it also shows us where some of our mental health crisis is intersecting with our social fabric. And so I want to take a public service announcement here. All right, because the thing is that whether you were a parent or a neighbor or you have the position to be an auntie, I want to ask each and every one of you to find some teenagers that you can support right now, because things are very, very dire. And it is not looking good in this country. And I want to keep as many young people alive as possible. And you can be that cool auntie. You can actually, as a parent, you can be the person who makes certain that there are cool aunties that are around. But I invite each and every one of you to take this seriously, because this is a huge challenge. And this has nothing to do with social media. And so when we're talking about rises of mental health issues, when it comes to where young people are at, this is not a technology issue. Technology is where it's spilling onto. This is a choice that we've made as adults to erase young people's access to other adults in their life. Okay, next section. I will pull them together, I promise. In 1925, an anthropologist named Marcel Mauss published a book entitled The Gift, where he described the practices of how gifting worked within an indigenous community. And he was very much responding to an economic logic that said that, I'll pick on an economist in the room, that said that, if I give you money, you give me service, and I don't need to ever see him again, right? And that's a really known way of thinking about exchange, a traditional social exchange approach. But what has been noticed is there's other forms of social exchange. Right? And those social exchanges can be like, I can give you something, a gift of my time or small gift, and then she's indebted to me, right? And that indebtedness means that I'm going to get a gift in response, and we're going to form a social relationship over time. And that's a really powerful thing because it is the practice of gifting and receiving and then regifting back. And there are all sorts of social protocols to this, right? There are rules to this, right? I can show up to your house and it's appropriate for a dinner for me to bring, say, a $20 bottle of wine, assuming that I know that you drink. And if not, I don't bring wine, right? But there's rules. If I come showing up with a $200 bottle of wine, that gets weird. Like, what's up with that? But if I also show up with a $2 bottle of wine or empty-handed, that's also a little weird, right? So like, how do you actually find those social rules? And we build that through social processes in critical ways. This does not get fixed through automated forms, right? And so there's nothing more insane than watching things that try to automate this process for you, right? The act of remembering someone's birthday and saying happy birthday is a form of a gift, an acknowledgement, a recognition. It is a way of increasing the strength of our social dynamic. If I have it as an automatic thing from Facebook that I go click on, that does not do that social work at all. Right? And I point this out because one of the things we've often forgotten is we see the actions, but we don't think about the underlying meaning of it, right? And those are two very different things. Academia is going through a crisis right now on aspects of social exchange, which I find really fascinating and also disheartening, because academia historically has been predominantly a gifting economy, right? Which is that I gift and do a review for you, dear editor, and now you owe me something so that when I'm editor, I can call on you to do the review too, right? And these are the ways in which we start to build social relationships. For those who are CS people, this is the beauty of a PC, right? So you build the social relationship through the exchange, through the guilting that goes with all part of it. But the thing is that anything that is exchanged under this form can also be exploited. Right? People can be lazy and refuse to do their reviews, and it sucks, right? Or you've got the arrogant people who are like, I'm too big and powerful for doing these reviews. That also sucks for everybody else, right? And so what we've seen is that, ironically, an entire sector that has really been built on a gift economy and criticizes capitalism has decided to go seriously capitalistic on trying to solve this problem, which is to pay people for reviews. And the reality is there is no review that's worth $5 to me to do. I do it for a social exchange, nor am I going to want to do it for a little checkbox that can go on my CV somewhere. And so what we've done is we've broken down the social dynamic in part because of the scaling function of the review system. And this is where I will explicitly blame the conference culture of CS because it is truly the worst at this. Because the amount of content going into the pipeline means that there is no way to do it in ways that are socially functional, right? And we keep breaking these social formations. I point this out because it is critical to think about how forms of gifting of time, gifting of energy, form the social fabrics that are at the core of the society that we live in and that we take for granted until it starts to break down. And this is where we get to this interesting dynamic of where do those social structures not play out the way we expect it to. And this is where I want to highlight parasociality. So parasociality is a different kind of relationship and one that we are starting to normalize pretty heavily through what's going on with influencers and online environments. Parasociality means that I know every detail about you. I am paying attention to you and your life, but you don't know squat about me, but I feel very connected to you. And this, by the way, has a long history. I love going back to like real celebrity culture, right? Where people thought they knew every detail of the Beatles, right? And the fandom was unbelievable. But of course, the Beatles didn't know who any of these people were, right? And that is a dynamic that we have now scaled through different kinds of online environment. It doesn't mean that this is inherently unhealthy, right? There is joy in parasociality. And I want to say this as somebody who's created a fan website here in 1994 at CMU. I had my first internet access was here, and I created an Ani DeFranco website that I have maintained since I've been here in 1994. And I am adamant of never meeting her because I just want to be a fan. And you know, if you have kids and they know like every detail of like a Star Wars character, right? Like, you know, there's joy in this dynamic. And in many ways, this is where the friendship and parasociality, the technology started to blur these in different ways. Originally, the idea was that these sites were going to help you find friends, but friends assumes that you have that meaningful gifting relationship, that you have the sense of exchange. But it took a much longer time until we started to realize that that wasn't how this always played out. There were big battles on Friendster called fakesters, right, which were actually instantiating the forms of parasociality. But then we started to see Twitter was the first to really allow parasociality to be at the core, where you could actually follow somebody without necessarily requiring them to be a friend. And as you built those social relationships and you started to realize that there are different kinds of ways of connecting, the challenge with it is these are a lot more monetizable, right? There's a lot more money in structuring parasociality and in structuring inequitable social exchanges than there is in supporting and enabling equitable ones. And so what we started to see is a set of norms that emerged on social media, where we kept getting more and more focus on these extremes. And we started to see, you know, what Alice Marwick and I would refer to as context collapse, where the ability to manage these, you know, ways of paying attention at scale and the different versions of people's peer relationships became untenable. And one of the coping mechanisms was to increasingly turn these platforms away from things that were truly social into things that were exclusively parasocial. So if you look, for example, at TikTok may be a form of social network site, but people are not overwhelmingly paying attention to their friends. They are overwhelmingly parasocial, right, in their relationships. And people do not perform just for their friends in most of these environments. This is also true of what's happened to Instagram, and Instagram is still in the more of the tension around it. But of course, you see all the algorithms pushing you towards more and more parasociality rather than meaningful sociality, because again, it's much more monetizable. So it is scary to me to think about how this was the summer of 2009, where Alice Marwick and I started really looking at the costs of micro-celebrity. This is before we had influencers or creators or all of the other terms that would go on. And Alice would go on and write a beautiful book about how this kind of influencer culture, parasociality culture was playing out. But neither of us understood how much more extreme this would get. There's a lot more great influencer work right now, and for some of you who might be paying attention to it, I want you to think about the real difference of what are the social fabric formations that occur when you have parasocial relationships versus the social formations that occur when you have meaningful peer relationships, etc. The other thing to know about parasociality is that it tends to form a false sense of belonging, which can actually also be exploited in critical ways. Like, it is great that I think Ani DeFranco is my best friend, right? Like, that's all fine and well. But if I actually need somebody and I think that Ani DeFranco is going to show up for me, I got a problem, right? And that false sense of connection is one that becomes really costly when people start to hit crises. And they start to hit crises in different ways. And I realize I don't have a slide on this, but I want to sort of riff for a second, because one of the most challenging pieces of data I dealt with when I was doing my work on young people was looking at the It Gets Better campaign. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but this was Dan Savage, who was worried about the increased number of young people dying by suicide who were LGBT identified. And so Savage and a lot of other famous celebrities decided to make these videos promising it gets better, you know, basically stay alive, get past this high school thing, which sucks, and you will be okay. Challenge is young people started making these videos because they wanted to be a part of those community. And Dan Savage created the conditions that it felt like anybody could make a video. After all, it was on YouTube, so why not? But for a year and a half afterwards, I tracked reported deaths of suicide by young queer folks. Overwhelmingly, they had made videos. And they had made videos hoping that they would be a part of a community, they would be a part of a feeling of belonging. They made that video. Dan Savage didn't pay attention to them. But their classmates paid attention to the fact that they made a video, and it became a form of massive torture for young people rather than a form of empowerment. So there is cost to the false sense of community. And one of the things about technology is that, again, because there's economic incentives into creating the conditions where you can feel like you're a part of something, but you don't get the support when you really need it. And that's one of the things we have to sort of separate out. Of course, there's a lot of money. I want to point this out because parasociality is coming up again with AI chatbots, right? And there's different versions of this, and I want to be clear about this. The number one support structure for somebody struggling with mental health when they need to talk to somebody is not a therapist. It turns out therapists are really hard and expensive. It is a dog, right? It turns out lots of people turn to their dogs for advice. Now, what are they expecting to get back? They're not getting back verbal advice. They're getting back licks. Right? They're getting back love. And so there's this ability to actually have relationships and get social support from non-human actors. And I want to flag that because I think it's really important to acknowledge the aspects of it. It's also important to acknowledge the multiple kinds of therapy that are out there, and that there's a whole sets of branches of psychological therapy that are nothing more than just having a therapist agree with you as you talk. I say this because having gotten the privilege of looking through some of the chat logs of AI, I want to point out how much of this looks like dogs and the silent therapist, right? Where it's just the need to be able to vocalize. This is not inherently problematic. I actually have no problem with this because you can talk to the wall for all I care. The ability to articulate out your feelings and have some way of iteratively going through that can be beneficial. It's why we believe in diarying or journaling. It's why we believe in a lot of other practices for self-soothing, if you will. But that is very different than a parasocial relationship where you believe a celebrity to actually being talking back to you, or you believe that this AI is real. And this tension is going to be at play in a lot of the different battles over what's going on with regard to AI. So I've been trying to think about this, as I mentioned, we talk about good, bad, and ugly, but how do we deal with interpersonal conflict? How do we deal with the fact that, one of the things that people like about AI is that the AI is nice to them, right? And people kind of suck. Right? And what does it mean to actually have to deal with interpersonal conflict, and how do we deal with different interpersonal conflict? And for those who are younger, this is a very famous 1980s movie. It was all about having people of different types come together and try to navigate interpersonal conflict. So I was trying to go through data, and I spent a lot of time looking at different forms of data around interpersonal conflict. The most famous, of course, is bullying, right? But the thing is that bullying has a very specific definition. It's an Olveus definition. It's psychological, physical, or social aggression repeated over time by people of differential physical or social power. I've been saying that obviously for a long time. And I say that because there's also drama and there's also harassment. And these are two very different things from bullying. And we had the fascinating dynamic of actually getting a full-on natural experiment during COVID around bullying. Because everybody was convinced that bullying was so much worse online and that the internet was causing bullying. And this had been such a drumbeat for so long that I had been waiting for a condition where we could actually test whether or not that was true. Because based on all of the studies I was seeing, when we look at it statistically, there was no increase of bullying connected to technology. And then we had a condition where we got to have young people be maximally online all day long and not ever allowed to interact in person, right? This would seem to be the ultimate moment where we would get maximal bullying. Bullying disappeared. It went through the floor. Because bullying is entangled with all of the social dynamics of everyday environments. And you have to work it through those relationships and through those dynamics in different ways. And so when we saw bullying disappear, it raised a lot of critical questions. Now, people want to say that the answer is to get rid of technology. I'm going to not argue that the answer is to get rid of school, but arguably getting rid of school will do more to get rid of bullying than getting rid of technology. And in fact, we actually saw that in the United States, where we saw homeschooling go through the roof. Not during peak COVID, but afterwards. Because what happened is people went virtual online for so long, they got to actually see how schooling was without bullying. Then they were sent back to school and they were like, oh, hell no. And they wanted to go back to being homeschooled, right? And so this is a really interesting phenomenon. And it's where you can see the differences in the US and elsewhere, where it is illegal to homeschool. The US allows it, many countries do not. So what happens as we navigate this? Because if you deal with this interpersonal connection, you have to find ways of addressing it. And one of the most important practices for addressing it is a system known as social emotional learning, which, by the way, has been outlawed in many states at this point, which is a challenge, which is about building psychological and social resilience, right? Which is to say that one of the things we know about bullying and other forms of interpersonal conflict is those who are engaging in aggression are usually themselves struggling, as well as those who are on the receiving end of bullying are often themselves socially not fitting in as much, right, within those environments. That is how that dynamic often plays out. And the interventions you do are building resilience amongst those who are often targets and targeted by this process, and making certain that the person who's being aggressive gets the support they need. That is what it means to start building social emotional learning. And that's one of the reasons why it's become frustrating to me to watch this outlawed in different places. But this is also what's critical to thinking about the social fabrics within schools. So when we think of bullying, we tend to also focus on young people, or perhaps colleagues at work, depending. But we're not looking at actually how to navigate social conflict. This goes back to parents not role modeling what it means to have friendship. They're also not role modeling how to negotiate social conflict. So kids do not see adults navigating social conflict. And I don't just mean within the domestic relationships, right? So not just about the partners. They're more likely to see that than about friendship. What they do see in terms of how adults are navigating social conflict is online. This is not pretty. Right? Because what it is turned to online is just outright aggression for aggression's sake, leveraging the parasocial, leveraging the fact that I can attack you and I don't have to see you. And you get to see this normalization of whenever I'm feeling frustrated, whenever I'm feeling isolated or confused, whenever I'm feeling like I don't belong, the answer is to go on Twitter and scream. Right? This is a very terrible role modeling that we've had in terms of how to navigate different forms of interpersonal conflict. It's also not acknowledging that the critical process of conversion to certain ideologies is a sense of belonging around this. So I foolishly decided to embed myself and a team within white nationalist movements in 2015, 2016. I don't recommend this. This is not good for one's mental health. But one of the things that we watched was how they would radicalize young people and who they would target. They would target the same people that we dealt with in schools with bullying, the vulnerable, the people who felt like they were isolated, like they didn't belong, that they had no sense of connection, people who didn't have a framework with which to make sense of the world, and they gave them a framework and a community. And I want to flag that because that is essential. And that is one of the toxic dynamics that we've seen in terms of a lot of these online communities, far from the days where these were the communities that were supporting people. These are the communities that are helping people become radical as a process there. And so one of the things we've also seen is in terms of how this has actually affected things in other spaces. So for those who don't track disordered eating and self-injury work, there's been these online communities that actually started when AOL banned the word anorexia. So AOL banned the word anorexia, and up popped communities that talked about themselves as pro-Anna and talked about their best friend Anna. And they formed Thinspiration communities. And what was powerful about these communities was that by participating in disordered eating practices, you could find a sense of belonging when you didn't otherwise have them. That is toxic. Right? And what you're showing is a weakness in the social fabric that is actually being enabled by these different kinds of online environments. The other thing to know, having done a bunch of de-radicalization work or worked with people who have done really much better de-radicalization work, whether you're dealing with gangs or terrorist organizations or navigating people who are struggling with disordered eating, the critical process of this is to actually rebuild the social fabric first and then address the behavior. You cannot address the behavior without addressing the social fabric. All right, so how can we do something about this? So what you're seeing is me laying out some of the pieces that I'm sort of embarking on as this new project, but I've also have a lot of things that we've learned already about being able to make meaningful interventions in this. And the first I want to flag is the power of things like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and other programs. I don't know how many of you have ever had the privilege of being at a 12-step meeting, but one of the most important things about 12-step meetings is that they create alternate communities as a way to also, while you're also navigating addiction, right? They give you a sense of community and belonging. Even if you don't know these people, you know you can show up to any meeting anywhere in the country and you can find those meaningful connections. That is powerful, right? And I say this because so much of what we're looking at is that we're just going to try to shut down technology rather than building the social fabrics to make the technology pieces irrelevant. These are the places that it work out. The other thing I want to flag is the kind of social engineering experiments that can go on. I mentioned sort of the beauty of college, but I want to give one of my other favorite examples. And again, the cultural reference is more for the old people, but there was this band that was very popular called Grateful Dead, whose music frankly sucked. But the popularity of their shows was unbelievable, even among people who thought their music sucked. Right, which is really fascinating because what's going on? So in a world before Ticketmaster and StubHub and all those other things, in order to get a ticket to a show for the Grateful Dead, you had to write to this lady. It was one lady, and you wrote to her and you're like, please, can I have a ticket for the Grateful Dead show in Pittsburgh? And she would send you back your tickets. You know, you sent a money order and she would send you back your tickets. And you didn't think anything of it. But she was actually doing one of the most interesting and sophisticated forms of social engineering without people ever realizing it. What she was doing is she was keeping a database, and I think that's probably a stretch. She was keeping a piece of paper that was a glorified database of every show you've ever been at and where she seated you. And so you would go to this Pittsburgh show and you'd be like, yeah, this is awesome. And then you'd write to her and be like, I want to go to the Memphis show. And she'd be like, in Pittsburgh, you were seated by these people who were also going to the Memphis show. So I'm going to seat you by them again. And you go to the Memphis show and be like, didn't I see you in Pittsburgh? It's so weird, fascinating. By the third show, you were best friends, right? And that is the Deadhead Formation. It was a social engineering project of building formations by creating the conditions where you could encounter people over and over again. And I want to say that because for all of you who are professors, you can create those conditions in your classrooms. Right? You create the conditions where people get to encounter one another. That is, in effect, what a major is. But you can actually be very specific in how you cultivate it. But I want to flag how important this is in a lot of different network formations. And if you think that that's a weird and irrelevant example from the 70s, which kind of is, I want to point out how powerful Donald Trump's rallies are. And I don't know if any of you have been to any of them, but they are phenomenal because what they are people showing up and tailgating for 3 to 5 hours ahead of time, just like they did with the Dead, hanging out with all these other people, finding different forms of connections, feeling a sense of belonging, going into the venue, just like they did for the Dead, and having to deal with the headliner, if you will, failing to show up on time. Trump is notorious for being 3 hours late on average, just like the Dead. And what ends up happening is that people build their connections in the stadiums, in the communities, and they leave midway through his talks. And I don't care what you've read about the media being like, it's so boring that people leave. They didn't come there for him. They came there for community. And one of the things that we're struck by and struggling with in a post-COVID era is how desperate people are for community. And there are lessons that have been learned from the 70s that are back with us in all sorts of social formations in ways that are not necessarily recognized in the present and how powerful they are. But what I give Trump tremendous credit for is that he has figured out how to leverage community as a centerpiece of building a nation-state project. And I say this because this is so less appreciated in the academic environments that we're living in. Communities can be nurtured, they can be built. That doesn't mean that the technology is totally irrelevant, but they have to go hand in hand. They have to be really, really connected to one another. Because the technologies right now can be used to exploit for very radicalized kinds of connections, but they can also be used to actually build kinds of supportive connections. And it's really easy to blame technology. And most of the laws that we're seeing are actually trying to block people from technology. And what a lot of politicians fully understand is that that is actually not going to necessarily result in the really positive things that people imagine, that it's going to result in different kinds of social dependencies. So when you block young people from accessing social media, what you do is you make them more dependent on their parents and more dependent on the communities around them. And what this sadly will also mean is that we will see a spike in suicide completion. We will see mental health crisis go through the roof. This will not address mental health, it will make it worse. So right now, these technologies are being used as sort of a last resort in different ways for young people who are struggling, but we're not building the backstops for that. Like I said, I really thought the internet could build social communities. I was stupidly naive. It is us. It is all of us individually. And it's the choices that we make about how to purposely and intentionally build social relationships. We do that as a university project. We can do this within our own communities in all sorts of different ways. We had historically got to rely on a lot of institutions that were structured and available for us, whether this was the religious communities or whether this was, other sort of bowling alleys, if you will, to riff on Putnam. But now it's not just about building those bowling alleys back. It's about being very intentional about the relationships that we make. And there's so much power to be said for building those relationships and those networks. And this is what I hope you can take away from today. Thank you so much. I don't know how long we get for Q&A. I know that some of you have to leave. Do you know how long we get for Q&A before?
No, but I have a question.
I know you have a question. Go for it. Let's start. And bye to everybody who has to leave. I totally get it.
Yeah. I think we'll do like 10, 15 minutes of Q&A and I'll read things from the Zoom.
Great.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. What do you make of the current trends towards remote work? I mean, that seems, in my view, and in your interpretation, that affects also the social fabric.
So the first thing to know, there's a beautiful paper, and it has a lot of authors, one of which is Jamie Tivon, and it's a study of social tie formation and social tie relationships in corporations after a year plus of online only work during COVID. And one of the things that's really fascinating about their finding, which actually lines up with things that we hypothesized for a long time, but never got to test experimentally, was that during peak online time, strong ties got stronger than you've ever seen, and weak ties disintegrated. And so what happens in a work from home environment is that you can be far more productive if your job is to be like a cog in a machine and simply execute. It is far more effective to be at home, far more effective, right? And you have focus time, you get all these other things that go right for you. But the consequences of this are you don't build the social relationships that allow the health of the organization and the health of your own personal professional career. And so you don't build those weak ties that are the things that are your upward mobility and your outward mobility from that particular job. So if you want to do that job as a cog for forever, online or staying at home is your best bet. But if you're looking for different kinds of social mobilization, having the ability to go and make relationships is absolutely critical. And it's also critical for bosses or people that are at senior levels who want to nurture a broader thing. So there's certain things that we know we need to do in person in terms of long-term health statistically. One is about brainstorming and creativity. It turns out people are terrible about this, even with all of the fancy new tools online. They're good at extending a brainstorm into an online environment. They're good at leveraging, Figma from their, in-person gathering and building on it at different pieces. But it's about the ebb and flow. And so the things that I'm watching in companies, organizations in general, are finding ways of bringing people together and then putting them back out, bringing them together. That seems to be the best balancing structure versus the just everybody show up to work. The problem with telling everybody to just show up to work also is that it just builds absolute resentment within the organization because people aren't seeing themselves as being a part of a broader system. They just hate being told what to do. Turns out humans are human. And so the thing is that that's its own form of conflict. So rather than thinking of it as like, how do we actually meet these broader goals that are not just about delivering our, product on time, but also making certain that we have this other structure at play. That's also playing out in different ways. I know that there's some grad students in this room, and I think we're all starting to see this, right? Which is that this grad student cohort did not build the social relationships that they would normally form through conferences, and it is costly right now. right? And so this is for all the grad students, go out of your way, not just for yourself, but for everybody around you to build those social relationships, because they're not just critical for the short term. And that's how we know how to evaluate them. They're critical in the long term. So the relationships one builds in grad school end up being truly lifelong relationships. I've got 2 of them in the room, that end up being these powerful forms for they sustain you. Little hint, grad students, professors are going to die by the time you're at that age, right? Like the point is to build the relationships with your peers, right? Like that is what's critical. Too many grad students focus upward rather than focusing outward and within the next like 2 levels, right? So it's like, don't pay attention to the full professor, pay attention to the assistant professors, and pay attention, like that is your peer group. Sorry, old people. But like those relationships and formations sort of are there. And so I think we're still seeing all of the different flavors of it as it plays out. But we're also seeing collapse of a lot of different kinds of social structures. Sales is actually in a really bad place in many organizations. So the thing also to keep in mind is that means that the powerful actors of today are maintaining power longer. And it's actually harder to create competition in this moment because the competition requires alternate network structures that are not easily being built right now. And that's become a huge thing in certain industries in terms of creativity. But then again, in a lot of industries right now, things are just being blown up and for different reasons. So like one of the things that's painful to watch about the tech industry at this moment is that because they have self-narrated themselves into a belief that the only future is AI, they are pre-using AI as a justification to do mass layoffs in order to make the company as lean as possible, which is also critical for certain kinds of market structuring. And they're disintegrating the social fabrics within their organizations. And they're investing as much of their capital on resource-heavy things, GPUs, for example. And so what you're seeing is that the tech industry, what I mentioned earlier, whose power was in those strong relationships, that has fallen apart. Silicon Valley is so structurally segregated, in terms of relationships, where people end up in these little buckets longer term, and they're not building that. And that has a lot to do also with 5 years of not working in person, which is really at cost. So there's a lot of things at play here. But again, I think that the Jamie Tivon et al., she's not the first author. I want to say she's like middle or last, but she's the one I can remember. That's a beautiful article to start with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danah. Terrific talk. Thank you. I want to ask, when you talk about the social formation, you covered lots of healthy functions. Do you also think this social formation also involve some non-necessary healthy function, for example, social comparison? So I'm asking because I see these teens when parents encourage them to cut off the digital times. They worry about they were left behind. They want to invest time for building their self-presence or improve their marketability. And this is also complicated with the capitalism this society encourage them, right? And I also see some teams, they become more aware, they self-cut those digital times. So how would you help encourage teams to do this trade-off? Because I think they are anxious about how do they build their self, because their self-presence is very, very entangled with this online platform.
So a couple of things that are at play here. My general advice right now is not to teenagers, it's to adults, because I think adults are the biggest part of the problem at this moment. And then I feel like adults need to do a lot more role modeling, a lot more intentional engagement about how they think about those dynamics. I say this because I think we've already put so much pressure on young people, and we just keep putting more pressure on young people. And they're, when we talk about anxious young people, they are an extension of anxious parents. Right? And the anxiety of parents around mobility and opportunity is through the roof. And part of it, of course, is that, especially in this country where we're living in a dying empire, we are struggling with the idea that young people will not have as many opportunities, as much wealth, as much resources, as our generation, who is extremely exploitative of nature and economic conditions. right? They are not going to be as wealthy, nor should they be, because that's not sustainable, right? And so the thing is that what we've come to is that we put, especially amongst elite communities, we put so much pressure on kids to at least get to our status, and that becomes so much less and less tenable. And so that pressure on them means that they're responding to this in different ways. They're responding to it with like really absorbing that pressure and desperate to perform at a level that they will often fail at. And I will say that this is one of the things that kills me. When you actually look at schools, where are the highest levels of suicide completion in high schools in the US? They are at the elite schools, right? Palo Alto High is usually the highest, right? This is ridiculous. These are kids with serious money and opportunity and freedom, but it's the pressure and the cost that we're putting on our face. So as parents, we have to think through, like, what are the values we want? Do we want our kids to be happy, or we want them to have this form of success in a world where things are spinning out of control? Because that is a costly place. The second thing is that young people, and then the other way is they respond toxically, right? They break their relationships with parents, which is really costly, right? And it's one of the things, like, the best studies on this actually have to do with LGBT youth. It turns out LGBT youth in this country are the most upwardly mobile and most downwardly mobile population in the country. Why? Because if they come from elite environments, they walk away from those social ties in order to have one where they will be accepted and validated. That's the downwardly mobile. And if they are from low-income environments, they run away from their environment as well, but they often tend to go to urban environments where they'll be supported, and they end up finding networks that actually help them in ways that where they came from were not. So I say those conditions because a lot of it, when we're talking about kids, again, at aggregate rather than how do you support a specific kid, at aggregate, we have gotten to a point where things are, I feel like we're putting so much pressure on the kids that we're putting them at risk. And instead, I believe a lot of it is helping them see the social structures around them. The stuff that I am talking to you about, like seeing those social structures, seeing the importance of relationships, teenagers get it. They can understand what you're talking about. They understand then what the project of education is, which is really helpful because, frankly, many of us have experienced this, where you have an 18-year-old who worked their tush off to get to an elite school and spend their entire first semester drunk, right? Because they suddenly have freedom. And that's a setup for the danger, right? So a lot of it for me is like, how do we support them through those transitions and build the frameworks to understand and make wise choices? How do we help them see the benefit, not just of them fitting a CV or a resume, and help them seeing a social relationship structure that's going to be critical for them? They are very able to see it. They are also very able to see how hypocritical adults are, right? And I think this is the thing that is also really tricky right now, because it's just like, I mean, I always joke, again, old people reference, I grew up with "this is your brain on drugs," right? Followed, which was like an egg, followed by, the egg smashing and obliterated. And so, this dynamic of like, if you just smoke marijuana, you're going to end up being a heroin addict, which was the narrative that I grew up with. Not helpful. We are also doing versions of that with young people. The other thing about those PSAs from the 80s and 90s is they were also followed by, "I learned it from watching you, Dad," right? Which is another big PSA around drug addiction. And I say this because if we want to help young people get through these moments, we don't tell them what to do. We show them opportunities. We make futures possible for them. And I think that is, for me, like the hardest and most critical part of that process. Yeah.
I totally agree with you when you're talking about building social ties. Like I was advised by Douglas Rushkoff, who is like Teen Human, advised by Lori, who does human factors. And so I guess my question is about, with certain things, maybe actually decreasing potential social ties, like the universities are under attack to prove why they're giving scholarships, why they're giving financial aid, potentially being turned into private institutions instead of nonprofits. Voucher systems, right? Like people sending their kids to different schools, and other things happening in society that may potentially decrease sort of this post-civil rights society where we, desegregation and people going to public schools and the system where you have a lot of people mixing. We're also seeing things in private organizations that are sort of making people afraid of including certain populations who were not previously included, maybe pre-civil rights. So if we're entering this era, how do you suggest tackling the problem?
So This one is really tricky, especially when we're talking about racial justice formation, because the data has been conflicting about this for quite some time, which is to say that we're at a point where middle class populations of non-white communities have really been decimated, and we've seen a polarization there. So we've been helping support a certain segment of the population and not other parts of the population, and we are feeling it politically right now. And that's because I would say we were doing it macro first, right? We're sitting here being like, here are the rules and the laws and the institutions. And then we're not really thinking about what is the project that we're trying to build collectively from the bottom up. So my initial reaction, like the top down is going to get destroyed over the next 4 years, right? These projects, I mean, like, you know, and it's decimation in ways that I don't think even in elite colleges we talk about. For example, what's happening in the military right now is god awful, right? And it is because so much of it has been privatized since 9/11. There's been all of these super costs. The military was one of the most diverse projects in the United States from the 1950s on. And we actually have been destroying it long before the present moment. And it's scary to me because what we've done is destaticify it. We are, of course, right now destaticifying another institution, which is the administrative state. And, you know, again, for those who don't live in DC or don't know DC, this is the Black working class, is the administrative state. Like that has been entangled over and over again. So we are in a moment where we're going to have to reimagine it as the national projects at this level. And I'm under no illusion that we're going to be able to do the big P political work right now. You can't pass anything through Congress. You can't pass things through the states, right? Even Pennsylvania, like it's on any given moment. So the question is, how do you build the frames bottom up? And that's what I think each and every one of us can do. We can make concerted and cultivated work to build things bottom up, to be attentive to it. And to the degree that these institutions like universities are still lasting, I think we can actually do a lot to build it up within our classroom, to be intentional and to be transparent about it. The thing that kills me in all of this is that we are often not transparent about this aspect of the university project. In fact, most professors don't even realize its long history. And its long history was racist as hell. And so like, think about why we actually started changing away from testing in terms of the ability to get into universities. It was a very specific Jews are taking over the universities, we need to get them out kind of project, right? So we've had these moments over and over again. We're in another moment. And we're in a moment right now where anti-Semitism is being used to justify all sorts of psychotic crap. But it's actually just as much as we saw 4 years ago, where it's just like LGBT was used to justify certain things that were actually eroding systems. So my feeling right now is that I'm not making moves at big P political partisan, you know, or institutional levels. I think that the move comes much more locally. And I think that if we're all aware of the local work we can do a lot to not just sustain, but to actually strengthen. Because I actually feel like we've actually taken for granted, especially for those who are on the left, we've taken for granted the idea that this could be fixed institutionally, and we have not prioritized the local community cultural work. And I want to, call out, there are some amazing cultural institutions that have taken that seriously and then actually watched themselves get defunded in different ways. And so I'll give one example, because I've always loved Color of Change. Is sort of this amazing nonprofit organization. And one of the coolest things that they did before COVID was that every Sunday in cities around the country, they had women's brunches. So for Black women from across the communities that they operated in to come and have brunch. They seated people just like a Grateful Dead show. They were so thoughtful about it, and they were building local capacity. And the thing is that when the COVID happened, obviously things disintegrated, but then funders got distracted and didn't want to work on it. So one of the things I say is like, this doesn't require mass funding. These are not the kinds of things that you have to do only when a nonprofit exists that get funded. These are choices that each and every one of us can make. We can create Sunday brunches. We don't need a church. We don't need a nonprofit to do that work. We need the commitment and the recognition of it. We can create book clubs. We can create these things. And so this is the thing that I worry about right now, is especially watching from the left, where folks are just like, well, the institutions are being destroyed, so, we're going to throw fire and then yell at the institutions. I'm like, this is the moment to do it ground up. And I really hope more people invest in doing that ground up right now, because that's critical for the long term success of this. And it also means going and being strategic about different kinds of formations, right? And that's hard work, right? But the thing is that that's work we can all collectively do. And it was like some dumb thing that I give to everybody who attends a conference. One of my students is to say, come back from every conference with 3 connections you actively sustain. If you actively sustain 3 connections from a conference for a year, you are building social relationships with value. And you can be intentional about which relationships, depending on your values, you really invest in. Small acts of kindness. Read a paper that you love. Write a note so that, do not write to the old people. Write to your peers. Write to the other graduate students. The assistant professor was like, this really inspired me. Here's 3 things that it made me think about. Gifts, small acts of gifts. And so that's where I'm like, I think we've been losing the ability for institutions to do this well for a while. And we now have a moment we just have to accept that the institutional structuring is going to fall apart. So like, what does it mean to do it ground up? And we can build alternate futures this way. The future is not preordained, right? The futures that we collectively create are where real power is situated. And so I think that's a lot where it's like, take this moment of reckoning, stop taking for granted institutions because we don't get to. Let's build it. Let's build the future we all want to be a part of. And that lets me quit. Thank you guys.